don't think, in the beginning, I don't think there's anything that my research has to do with politics or policies. I just do science. Well, when you do science, particularly when you do engineering, I work in an engineering school, whether you know it or not, in the design space, you are making choices that have ethical implications. So you have to recognize that first, and then reflect and discuss. And that's one of the things, obviously, that the STIR projects stir up. They stir up the kind of reflection. All right. And who can the scientists have such a discussion with? Well, one of the examples is from STIR, embedded ethicist, social scientist, who was willing to engage even to the point of collaborating. And I'm going to say more about that. And I think in the end, you might get a twofer. You might get better science and better social impacts. So we'll play with that some too. And the point is, the point of the reflection part of this is reflecting on the systems in which both are embedded, the social scientist, the ethicist, the scientist. It opens and creates a space for movement. We're all embedded in systems all the time, and if you can get people to reflect on it, they may see opportunities for movement or open up new spaces. I say what I hope is obvious to all of you here, which is why I'm flying through this. But it turns out to be quite profound. And we've talked about the 3 stages of modulation. I'm just putting up here to remind us. I'll give you an example of some work I did upstream at the beginning of a project. We've got some good midstream examples here. Fewer downstream examples here. Although some of the last couple of talks may be getting into that as we think about the products that come out of innovation. All right. And there's an inverse relationship between freedom to change, a technical direction, and whether the project is upstream, downstream, or midstream. Upstream, obviously, you have the greatest degree of freedom, and you know the least about what's going to happen next. Now, having said that, you find that these stages all get confounded. So you go within a midstream research project, you can have an upstream phase and some new opportunity. So a first kind of rough working hypothesis, and I don't mean this in the formal scientific I can say hypothesis 3 times, in the formal hypothetical sense that is used by scientists, but in a more informal or heuristic sense is that a humanist social scientist working in one of these situations has to gain what Harry Collins calls interactional expertise. We're going to push the idea a little bit in this talk. The basic idea is this is someone who comes in and gains fluency in the language of what Collins calls an esoteric specialty, like one of the nanoscience examples we heard about. And Collins had this experience himself when he went into multiple gravitational wave physics labs and gained what he called interactional expertise in gravitational wave physics to the point where he could talk like he was a member of the community. And pass as one, and even understand their jokes and even tell one, these sort of inside jokes. He could pass as a member of the culture without actually being able to do the research himself. He couldn't run a detector. And there are other examples. There's a great book in the SDS literature, Stephen Epstein, showing the same process with AIDS activists who actually join the scientific panels to determine the direction of research, further research on AIDS. In order to do that, they have to gain interactional expertise. Right. And so my second working hypothesis, to impact research and research direction, you're going to have to form a trading zone. And the most, I'll talk about shared metaphors in a minute, but the most critical thing here is this shared language. Starting out with a shared jargon. You all experience this who are in these projects. You have to understand one another. And this can go both ways. So, really, one of these things is working very, very well in the lab. You find the scientists and engineers can begin to adopt some of the languages of the social scientists and the ethicists and use some of those concepts and start running with them. And the trading zone idea, I won't elaborate on too much here, but I think it's a profound solution to the problem of incommensurability. I give Peter Gallison a lot of credit for pushing this in his historical work. He said, okay, Kuhn says there's this thing called incommensurability between paradigms, so how come these people from very different, apparently paradigmatic communities work together all the time to build things like particle detectors, radar, other kinds of technologies, make advances, create new multidisciplinary fields that blend aspects of others. His conclusion was they learned to trade with one another, starting with the simplest jargon. They don't even begin to understand each other's worlds. They don't have to. You know, I need this from you, you need this from me, and we trade it. It can be money, it can be time, it can be other things. It can work its way through boundary objects. And my thesis, the one I promote in this Trading Zones volume and in the Trading Zones workshop at the bottom here, I note out of which the volume emerged, which was held at Arizona State. Arizona State was a tremendous host for that. This is my pre-NSF Program Officers Day. I got some NSF money, but Arizona State provided a lot of other resources and great intellectual stimulus to this work. One of the theses I tried to promote is there's a connection here. The interactional expert can facilitate a trading zone because here's somebody who can talk two languages or parts of two languages. All right. So it would be fun, I think, to try out this framework on some of their case studies. I'm not prepared to do that in detail today, but I'll give you some hints of how it might be done. And this also will push and alter the framework itself. And there may be some failures in these studies, too. That's why I put that failure to engage. There may be cases where some things don't work. It's very, very important to attend to those. They're only failures if we don't learn from them. So I did, without realizing it, I did a kind of a STIR experience pre-STIR with a little tiny NSF grant many, many years ago. I worked with a colleague who's a material scientist and nanoscientist, James Groves. We shared a graduate student, and our goal was to see what would happen if we put societal dimensions up front in a graduate student's project. This is a very tiny project now. We're not talking about a whole lab, we're just talking about one person. We found a person who was silly enough to volunteer, and of course we funded the student. And our other goal was to make sure the student didn't have to be there for 5 years. The students wanted to get an ordinary, sensible degree in material science that would allow her to continue to work in that business. We said, okay, fair enough, you're going to get that. We'll add some stuff on top of it, but you're going to get that, and we'll get you out in a reasonable time if you do the work. And I consider this and I mentions here a little bit about what we did, but I consider this a kind of a tiny, tiny trading zone. It's not really a trading zone in the Galveston sense, but you can have it at a micro level because we had to divide up the resources, we had to exchange knowledge, we had somewhat different goals, but everybody's goals had to be reached. And I had to go through a little bit of the interactional expertise trajectory in this area of nanotechnology. I really had no knowledge at all of the deposition of nanodots, except of a very general sort. I had to learn about concepts like guided self-assembly and certain properties of metal oxides that made them better deposition surfaces, and gain enough judgment to help contribute intelligently to the research strategy discussions without, again, being able to do the research myself. So we had to make decisions about what project we're going to do next. We started out by saying, here are some global needs, issues, opportunities. Now within that, is there a project a student could do that might contribute in some indirect way to these? And it wasn't sufficient just to know the large high-level concepts. I had to be able to say, well, if we're going to approach this kind of thing, what's the next logical experiment? And fortunately, being a social psychologist of science helped because I knew a lot about scientific methods, scientific approaches, scientific decisions, and how you make them. And they eventually decided that I deserved to belong in a patent. I could belong on a patent application they made. I couldn't for the life of me figure out why, but they insisted, the informants insisted that this had made the process better. In particular, the material scientists said this made the science better. I wouldn't have stuck with this particular problem if it hadn't been for this research project. I would have looked for something easier. So we looked for something quite ambitious, involving new materials and a new deposition surface to try to create a new device that would be useful in eventually in remediating arteriosclerosis. Right? So in order to do this, I love the Mac PC. Mac and PC don't have a very good Creole. So I put my Mac slides into a PC, and it knows it's in a foreign environment. And they're trying to eat each other right now. But the diagram came out. This is my colleague, James Groves, said, you know, we need some kind of, he didn't use the term metaphoric language, but that was some kind of metaphors because we can't even talk about this stuff. So this should have been obvious to me, that you're going to need some metaphoric language to set goals. And as soon as he said it, I said, well, that's a great idea. Now, we all happen to like hiking, the three of us. So we picked hiking as a metaphor because we understood it mutually. And what we're trying to figure out is, so if you've got these, you know, distant, taller mountains, some really significant world ill or challenge or opportunity, what is a graduate student going to do that has anything to do with, let's say, curing heart disease down here in a 2-year project? You're not going to get that out of nanotechnology. And so my colleague said, well, what about if the graduate student builds a bridge that might lead to a trail that might lead eventually up to a more local goal, like measuring blood flow much more precisely, which was the sub-goal we set. So you could really learn a lot about the properties of cells. We brought in a biomedical engineer to work with us on that. And then the graduate student's project becomes definable. They can make a contribution with that larger goal in mind and understand that that's where the research is headed eventually, hopefully, that they'll make a tiny step. Notice also you could branch off in other directions from that bridge. All right. Now I'm going to introduce another concept that I think is very, very important when you talk about differences in values. The idea of moral imagination. And the essential thesis, I'll keep it, because it's actually a fairly simple concept, which is why it's good for me. I like things simple and clear. We learn much of our ethics from stories. Actually, they're embodied in rules and principles, but you know, you look at all the sacred books and you start with a story, the Good Samaritan, whatever story you like that illustrates the point. Now, the stories are fine, but these stories can become unquestioned assumptions. I refer to them here as mental models. We can confuse them with reality. We can think that they're the only possible way to proceed. Moral imagination opens up a space of considering other possibilities. Each person with their own story, with their own approaching things, has to recognize that those are views. Those are possible ways to behave. There are other ways to behave that may also be good and valuable. This is not the same as relativism. It doesn't mean that all ways of behaving are equally good. There are some that are, quite frankly, horrible and immoral. So, but it does mean you can at least start by saying, I've got a view about what good and proper behavior is and how to get where I need to go in moral and ethical terms. You may have a different value. We can at least start by recognizing that and being willing to move from our positions. All right. So moral imagination, in effect, to bring it back to the theme of this talk, is kind of like getting an interactional expertise regarding values. I can now understand your value system. I can understand where you're coming from. Doesn't mean I agree with it. And you can understand mine. All right. And then you can walk in somebody else's shoes. And it means you can see your framework and theirs, and now you can see both and maybe move somewhere together. So we needed to think a little bit more about moral imagination, maybe come up with an alternate metaphoric framework in addition to our metaphoric framework. And here I use the example of Greg Mortensen, who goes through this process. Mountain climber, eventually ends up in a village, changes his goal altogether, decides what I'm going to do is build schools, has made a career out of that. My ethicist friend, Patricia Werhanes, said, well, why don't you think instead, add to this diagram, the idea of instead of going to a mountain, you're going to a village. So sort of a classic engineering metaphor is we're going to this high technological peak, and that's going to solve a problem. Think about what group you're going to engage with, or where you're going to go, or how this technology is going to play out in a different context. So that's the value of having somebody come out and show us that we were operating from a framework that we were just taking for granted. It's a little moment of moral imagination. All right. So one of the things I'd encourage is looking at metaphors and the use of metaphors, which are often tacit. They're often implicit. They're not articulated in these kinds of STIR engagements. The kind of stories people tell about what does it mean to be a good scientist? What are your scientific idols? I wrote a paper many, many years ago for engineering educators about who are the engineering heroes in terms of good, virtuous behavior. These are the people we need to look at. These are the kind of things engineers will learn from. And I couldn't resist putting a picture of Barack Obama, who called for expanding our moral imaginations. I'm not sure he meant it in the philosophical sense, but I'll take it as an endorsement, and what I thought was a moving speech. All right. So I'm going to play a little bit now about a midstream modulation using Shannon's work as an example, and she described it in much greater detail than I will, fortunately. This is Shannon in our Norway retreat here with some of the other STIR students in the background, I believe. Okay. So what she did was she came into the Vancouver lab, as you can remember, and immediately experienced the language gap. And the language gap isn't just terms, it's embedded in other things. So it calls for developing some kind of a Creole and some kind of interactional expertise in what these people are doing. All right. And here are some quotes to support that, which he provided you with. feel like we're talking two different languages. The other party's not understanding social science. So you're a stranger in a strange land. There you're in a strange environment. And in this case, you're even trying to figure out what goals you want to get going. So she went from observer to participant. And one of the key steps was this business of learning to do a PCR. Now, here's a theoretical moment. And those of you who know Collins' work in intellectual expertise, it is purely verbal linguistic. There's no need for anybody to engage in any kind of hands-on practice, you know. And in fact, he thinks that most of science is gaining this verbal skill, even the verbal tacit knowledge. You know, I think in Shannon's case, we have an example of where it's very, very important to also do some of the hands-on work, to actually learn how to work with the hand and the eye alongside the laboratory researchers. I'm not saying it's true in every case, but that immediately struck me as intriguing. That's the reason I jumped on this particular case study. It's important for a variety of reasons. Oh, here she is. I had loved the hat. That's why I had to put that up. I've got a pretty crazy hat, too, but I forgot to put mine on for the talk, so it's not as good as yours. All right. Oh, yeah, we have that problem, too. I have an office where the heat is on in the summer and no heat is on in the winter. And I think this is how they try to get professors to retire early. I figure it's part of the early retirement program. Doesn't work. I just wear a hat. You know, what's the problem? I don't see what. Okay. So, so I previewed my point here and jumped ahead. So Collins' intellectual expert learns to understand the tacit knowledge associated with language. What Shannon did was gain semantic tacit knowledge, what Collins called. And also, in that you get some street cred. You're willing to get down and work with the locals and show that you value what they do enough to try to learn it. And they have the thrill of teaching it to you. And I think Antonio and I talked about this briefly, and it sounds like he had a similar experience, whether he went through all these stages, learning how to create an STM tip, build one, useful, you know. So now we have two examples at least of getting it, and that was also helpful to you, Antonio, right, in integrating with the researchers and having them see your value. Okay. He knows he can interrupt me and say no, no, no if I'm wrong, so I assume he hasn't. Right. And then another thing that happened to Shannon was she ended up transferring this hands-on or practical skill knowledge to a doctoral student in another lab who was doing PCRs. And there she is doing her PCR. Okay. One of my questions about this was, from a Collins standpoint, was whether the list of procedures that Shannon also used, because they had a nice way of doing it in your first lab, as I recall, a list of procedures, how critical that was, because Collins was countering it would be, oh, but you had a very good list of procedures, so really this was part of verbal tacit knowledge. It just happened to involve a little handwork. I think there's something more going on there between hand and eye than Collins would allow, but that I'm sure would be his defense if he were here. He has the procedures right there. Okay. So we'll give it to Harry Collins and give him some gel and say, here's the verbal knowledge, go. And he would say, but I don't have the verbal tacit knowledge. You see how these things go and go. But my point is, it's intellectual expertise verbally, I don't think it quite captures all of what you need to have. And I look for, if any of you have examples of those, let me know, because I'm going to plan on pushing that point. I love to provoke Harry. He puts up with me, but, you know. I never quite get on the reservation, you know, with the latest strong program. And Courtney here talked about the mutuality of it. It has to be benefit for both parties. This is like, you know, Cooperation 101. So she wondered, what am I going to get out of this? What's going to happen? I'm going to have this person in the lab. I don't see that it does any great harm. She seems nice enough, you know. And there was no research hypothesis, right? So Shannon's come in and said, my research hypothesis is X. Here's this person just doing exploratory work. So I think that's something to look at and document. That a number of you have talked about the mutual benefit. We heard it in the last week. We talked about your benefit. You ended up talking to the people in your laboratory area, and they pinned up what you put on the wall. This is good. It should work both ways. Which is alien to the more traditional. Social sciences should just observe and not interact. This is participant observation. You're in there interacting and watching your impact on the system. And I could see a couple of benefits I can see that were mentioned here. You get to imagine alternate designs and experiments as a scientist. All right. Think of things you wouldn't have thought before. You even actually get, maybe it's a little bit of a hands-on task done for you, or learn better how to teach it. Teaching is the best way to learn. And so my next hypothesis about this is you can get better science in terms of societal impacts, research, I think the PC deleted a word there. No, research strategy and practice. So I've talked about research strategy. That's new choices. Practice, I'm less clear about that, but it may eventually, well, certainly practice in terms of things like learning to wear a lab coat and safe procedures. But as the social scientists or ethicists begin to learn some of these procedures, I wonder if there'll be some interesting things emerge there. And also, the larger goal, which is societal impact, societal benefit. All right. Now, as we scale up to collaborations, and some of you I hear are starting to do that now, and labs and centers and larger entities, there you're going to see trading zones a lot more. It may or may not be that useful to describe what Shannon was in as a trading zone. But it's going to be very important when you get to the organizational level. And now here the embedded social scientists have become a facilitator of trades and exchanges. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to go through this, but as this is in Dan's spirit, Don had to show that he had some complex diagrams go behind this. Here's a complex diagram of trajectories and trading zones. Ask me about it later. If you want a cure for insomnia, I'll be glad to explain it in great detail. But the point is, there are various ways you can diagram how trading zones can lead to new fields, new opportunities. So I'm trying to find visual ways of doing this and get away from just the kind of hand-waving. So one of the things that should happen, obviously, is to embed humanist social sciences in collaborations among labs. For example, the kinds of centers that the NSF supports. I think it'd be very valuable. And one of the things that could be done, and this is tricky, I've talked to a number of you about this, is getting information on the formation of the trading zones and feeding it back to the labs. Not feeding it back to the funder, because then it's coming from evaluation, formative evaluation. And you can start as a longitudinal study. Stay with the lab or center from the beginning throughout, or maybe bring in other researchers throughout to get a kind of an evolving history of it. Looking at the kinds of negotiations languages. So, for example, one could take a huge project like the ALMA project, the world's largest radio telescope, that's got multiple countries, multiple organizations, multi-million dollars, multiple years. It would be very interesting to see if you could have a collection of embedded humanists and social scientists looking over the stages of a gigantic project like this, documenting and interacting and perhaps even improving it. That's a huge scale. It can go all the way down to one, relatively focused center, or one lab like some of the ones we heard about in the last talk that have multiple components, multiple things are going on. It's not a single lab. It's a research organization. And they're starting to interact with other entities and agencies. And that gets us the idea of an inter-organizational trading zone. And again, you're going to see elements of that in this lab work. If you've got Seagate coming in, you're already interacting with another organization. You're interacting with UK research councils. You're interacting with the NSF. So all the people in labs are embedded in an organizational context. But I had a particular opportunity to observe one. I've worked basically as a volunteer, sort of representing NSF. I have to be careful not to ever quite represent NSF. I always represent me. I'm not as good at that as some of the organizational people are. It's interesting because they'll take off their hat. They'll say, okay, now my organizational hat's back on. Now I'm representing the FDA. And the tone of the remarks is very, very different. And then they'll pitch in as individuals and help things and say, now let me put my FDA hat back on. All right. I don't have enough hats to do that right now. The Strategic Planning Committee for the National Nanotechnology Initiative, I just jumped in and started to help them with it. It follows a series of strategic plans. It's a very bounded activity. It comes every 3 years. There's certain constraints on it. And so it's downstream in that this is an effort that's gone on for multiple years. It's also upstream in that it's setting a new agenda for the next 3 years. Okay. It involves multiple agencies. I was there with the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, National Institutes of Standards of Technology, NIST, Consumer Product Safety Commission. Each of these agencies had a representative on this strategic planning group. And those people were terrific to work with. Many of the people who were interested in nanotechnology, were really interested in a dialogue. It was tremendous intellectual dialogue. But they would always say when they put on an agency hat, and I have to go back and clear this with my agency. I think we reached agreement on this is exciting, but I don't know what's going to happen when I take it back to the EPA. I think I'm going to buy into this because this was not a top-down trading zone where one party could enforce its goals on another. I talk about types of trading zones elsewhere. There's some where there's very limited trade. One party holds all the cards and can force others to comply and dominate the zone. This is relatively equal. Yes, there's enabling legislation, but the agencies have to buy in to specific goals. Right? So it's a true, relatively equal trading zone. And we were trading, particularly, our object of trading was objectives. What specific objectives will be getting put forward? If they got too specific, people dropped off. If more general, people got happier. You tried to steer it that way. And the end result would be a document that would theoretically guide future developments, at least for the next 3 years, and that people would actually accomplish. And they would be presented to stakeholders for feedback. This would be a very interesting process to embed someone into study. And there were AAAS fellows working with us. They're tremendously valuable. Washington's a town where youth have an enormous impact on what's going on. And one of my thoughts was maybe there's an opportunity there to do some observation, reflection back to the group of their processes, and even perhaps provide some information from others. There's tricky business about confidentiality, but there are ways of protecting the confidentiality of the negotiations that might allow for us to keep records of those kinds of trading zones. So there's another, perhaps, STIR organization. Maybe not this one, but certainly other ones. And in particular, the LC portion of that strategic plan emphasized collaboration with ethicists, social scientists, scientists, and engineers, which is what you're doing here. And embedded modulations in things like this interagency zones or labs may become a way of accomplishing that goal. Okay. So that's kind of to inspire you. And I was glad to see a lot of nano projects here. It's a fruitful domain. Emerging technologies in general are a fruitful domain because you're moving into a space where there are many, many unknowns. And even if you're in a midstream thing, you're still kind of thinking upstream all the time and downstream. All right. So some observations here based on what I've heard and thought about. Some future directions STIR might consider. So it would be nice to have a way of comparing, and when I say experiments, I don't mean the form, I'm an experimental psychologist. I don't mean the formal experiment. I mean, seeing each of these STIR projects as a kind of exploratory research experiment. You're going into a situation, you're trying to figure out what's going on. If you have hypotheses, they're weak or soft hypotheses, sort of like the weak or soft hypotheses I proposed here. So how do you compare across these different? How do you establish a creole between the STIR projects themselves? You have some methods, you have a protocol. I saw that Don's mind, I think, is like mine. He's starting to develop a way of diagramming the flow or processes in one of these things. So I would encourage the development of tools that facilitate comparisons and generalizations across these different projects without blurring the fact that many of them are in quite different situations. If you're working in one of the labs you heard recently, where you're bringing in all kinds of other parties, you're in a more trading zone-like situation. You can be down in a very, very micro situation with a small lab where it doesn't feel much like a trading zone. The trading zone is outside of the lab. You're just seeing the results of it down there. And hopefully some of these concepts, interactional expertise and trading zones, will be helpful in doing that. And part of what you get out of that is then you can start developing, training may be the wrong word here, but preparation for other embedding experiences for the future. You can actually have a way of beginning to facilitate and train future social scientists, ethicists, perhaps even scientists themselves who are going to go embed themselves in another situation. Not quite the same as just the anthropology training, because you're doing something different, but it certainly has elements in common with participant observation. And I like the idea of embedding longitudinally and cross-sectionally. Cross-section means you go in and you take a little 3-week snapshot of something that's going on in a project. You're in for that moment and then you're out. And you can get a longitudinal view of a project by having 3-week snapshots at multiple stages in, say, a 5-year project. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. The other way to do it is actually embed longitudinally. Somebody's in from the beginning to the end, sees all of the stages of the life cycle. That's a much harder, more ambitious goal, and it need not be the same person, but that would be extremely interesting to look at. And finally, as I said earlier, you want to be able to scale it to these higher level entities where you might even eventually have, in some magical world, people embedded in several laboratories associated with a larger effort and somebody also embedded with the director or at the director level who's running around doing all these negotiations to keep the funding alive and keep the different projects going and has to come back and say, all right, we have to realign, as Robert does, we have to realign our efforts here, you know. Let's take our capabilities and start moving in a new direction. So you see all aspects of the system. And again, you have to be careful about confidentiality. You have to protect the company's knowledge. There are ways to do this. They're not simple, but it can be done. The case study may not be able to reveal all the names. All right. Be glad to take any questions you might have. For a little bit anyway. I don't believe you on time. I'm moderating for myself.
There's a trading zone associated with the kind of innovations that most of us in the lab have a terrible time with, and that's user-driven innovation. And can you say anything about what you guys know about how the user-driven innovation process works, especially when it involves creating new science to make the innovation work?
Well, it is a kind of a stir-like process in the sense that it might be useful to have someone. I'm glad you asked the question. It might be useful to someone to help facilitate it, because you have to figure out what the user needs, not what they want.
I don't understand. He doesn't understand what he wants, actually.
Yeah, no, that's right. So that's sort of like user 101 is the user does not, I mean, I'm not sure I really need this thing, but I never knew that I needed this thing, you know. I'm still not sure I need it. Sometimes I want to chuck it down the, but that's all right. Or an iPod or an iPhone or even the telephone. I did the history of the invention of the telephone. People didn't need a telephone at the time. But people didn't want a telephone. When it was created, they discovered they needed it. So user engagement is interesting. So it's a process, right? You've got to bring people in to engage with new technology prototypes, engage with new technology ideas, and see what they do with them and play with it. So you get, this is my view, you get a kind of a coevolution going, you know, in the very innovative technologies. Again, there's multiple cases. There's simple things like, can people hold this bottle and dispose of it? Okay, that's not a particularly interesting one. But we are trying to evolve a new technology and think this might be useful. You bring in users early on. You get in this sort of coevolutionary process. You figure out what they need, what they get out of it. And now I think the process is helped by some kind of facilitation. I think a lot of the computational technologies we have are no longer designed that way. You know, basically whatever Microsoft wants me to do, I'd better do it. That's going to be it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's the sort of the goal of service science, which is another area I'm interested in, is to really get to the point where at certain cases you're co-evolving technologies with the users. Not every time, not all the time, but at the very high end. Very exciting process. Did I see? Yes.
I'm from Genome BC, and over the last year we've spent quite a bit of time organizing teams around a competition. And it's a large-scale competition. It's applied. And there was an integrated component. So the teams were asked to really co-design the projects at the front end. Their proposals were developed together. And one of the strategies that we used was to help them to draw out or map out exactly what their collaboration would look like. Now, this sort of diverged from the pipeline model of innovation, which everybody's so familiar with and entrenched in. And so that led me to think about other metaphors that we might be able to use. And I started talking to people about other kinds of metaphors. And, you know, maybe the heat pump or the furnace, but then we'd have the problem of social scientists being full of hot air. And I mean, but this is really one of the concerns within this particular community that we're working with, is that how are these groups actually going to be contributing to the projects? So I'm wondering if you have sort of a metaphor that might, you know, work for this new model of innovation that we're all venturing into, that's quite general. After I gave my little talk at the staff meeting, and I had people come in my office and draw the pipeline over for me again, and, you know, draw circles within it. I mean, they want to stay in the pipeline. They want to stay away from arrows that go in two directions. They only want unidirectional arrows. So how do we find metaphors to move beyond this?
Well, you know, with that limited understanding of the project, I'm not going to come in and be an outside, so right? Projects. Right, so multiple projects having to work together.
Well, I'm talking about,
Okay.
I'm talking about a competition where we were encouraging people to develop their proposals at the front end for their projects. So, in other words, the usual mapping of how this would look for product development, right? The process and right? That is understood, and people understand that model. So when we're asking social scientists to contribute to that model, we're trying to fit it into that pipeline. I was suggesting that we use other kinds of metaphors to talk about innovation.
And their part of your problem is that people are worried about getting a successful proposal, and they figure, okay, if I come up with some other metaphor, maybe that's going to be a deal killer. So you have to be careful. But I would start thinking more of environmental or organic metaphors. You know, if you start getting to things like stream models, it implies turning and twisting. It doesn't imply going back, which you can, but turning and twisting, branching, opening out. So I think that some of those, but those metaphors particularly appeal to me. The thing is to get, it's hard in the kind of competition situation, to get people to start thinking about the metaphors they're using and say, is this really the way product development always occurs? Does it always occur like this? And anybody who's done it will say, of course it doesn't always occur like this. This is how it really occurs. Well, I don't, you know, not the people I talk to, but some of you have done product development can speak more about it.
Let's say at the innovation level, the level where you're trying to say that this is what we're looking towards with a product, right? They want to see it drawn like that.
Well, and that may be an idealized plan, too. It may have some heuristic value for them to say, ideally, we'd like it to work like this. It's not going to, but like that. And often you're forced into that by, when you present a drug to the FDA, you make the process sound more linear. When you write a scientific paper, you make it sound like it's hypothetical-deductive. So you may do the research in a different way, but you need to present it that way. It's an interesting issue. I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer to that.
Within the pipeline was, you know, one thing was suggested to me by somebody who's sort of voicing this idea that, you know, of course other things are happening within the pipeline.
And the other thing that stops it are stories of actual innovations and how they worked. So one of the things I would do in a case like that is I would give you some interesting innovation cases to look at where the innovation was not entirely linear and where there were surprises along the way and where the process may at the end have been reconstructed to look more linear, but it wasn't in fact when it happens. Not to say it never happens. You do get some linear innovations. I just don't know of many. Or at least they're linear afterwards because you lop off all the other branches. And say, like the story of the telephone, you know, in the end you can make it look like Bell followed a linear path to telephone. He didn't. He was considering multiple things. He had multiple things going on, and finally he settled on that particular one for reasons I won't go into here. We'll be here for several hours. But you could go back and reconstruct the process and say, I knew what he was after the whole time. And people who rewrite the history of the telephone often do that. And you just look and say, that's not what happened. I can show you the records.
No, it wasn't what happened. He had a sort of combinatorial approach, send a lot of hairs running and see which one won. But I wanted to thank the previous questioner because it prompted me something that came up in Paul's talk. Quite a few years back, Henry Chesbrough produced his book on open innovation, and that was kind of modified pipeline from the way I look at it. But in recent years, I've seen other models of open innovation emerge, particularly amongst the large pharma companies over here and one or two in Europe. And there are other models of open innovation. I would have thought this is a very, very interesting and fertile ground for you guys to really get stuck in and do some wonderful stuff to get some feel for what is likely to be the best open innovation model at the large company level, the small company level, the regional level. There's some good stuff there. Looking at Paul's case as a good case of a closed innovation, where you have a spider in the middle controlling everything. One wonders what would happen if that had been a little open innovation sort of group of three people. Maybe some interesting things would have come out. Maybe they would not have found about the nanoparticles on the plate, for example. Who knows?
That's right.
It's a suggestion.
Yeah. So one of the things, if you're thinking about STIR projects, one of the things you're looking for is are there metaphoric assumptions underlying this, and are the descriptions of the process that people give you, do they line up with the actual actions? Because people will say, I'm following Model X. And then in a nice way, I would suggest that in a very polite way, you can say, oh, that's interesting. Explain to me why you did this if you're following along this nice path X. You want to be careful and be non-threatening here. And then have them start thinking through and say, well, maybe we're not being entirely linear. And there'll be that moment of terror, but we're supposed to be linear. And that says, well, you may need to repackage the process so it appears to have been linear for a variety of things, for patents, for justification, for selling to the NSF. But it's also important for groups and teams to capture the actual processes that they're using at the time and look for the strengths and weaknesses in them. So it's more than just metaphors. It's trying to capture processes and show people what they're doing in a very nice, polite, and engaged way.
Mike?
Yes.
I think this can go even further. It's really exciting. I have been fortunate in my career to actually become embedded in international scientific steering committees and boards of directors. And there's another way that you can actually have a huge impact on the way that people are thinking in terms of to give you one example, you know, the IGBP alphabet soup of LOICs and LUC and GLOBEC and Pisces, and there's a whole load of these things that are just acronym after acronym after acronym. I was in one of them, Global Ocean Ecosystem Dynamics, hard science, oceanography, and they actually came to me. And I was very, very fortunate. I was asked, would I please come and help them get a human dimension, that's the lingo, into the way that the whole philosophy and policy of that group was moving. And that was an extraordinary experience. And one of the things that I've taken away from it is that the kind of thing that's going on here with STIR, with graduate students in labs, can be done up the levels, up the hierarchies a bit, and can then also, not only do you get this bottom up, which I passionately believe in, but you can sometimes get a meeting because you can get the top down and the bottom up coming together. And then you start to have impacts at the director's level as well as at the laboratory level, and interesting things start to happen.
Yeah, I violently agree with that. One of the difficulties about being, there's a lot of very interesting, wonderful things about being a program officer at the NSF, but it's a very interesting and complex job with multiple moving parts, and we often get administrators come in who don't understand it. And it's really hard to be managed by somebody who doesn't understand your work. And that's an example of that. A bringing together would not be hard, and there's multiple ways I know how to do it, but I can't do it within the system. And that's another thing where a STIR student or a set of STIR students say, I'm seeing this at the lab, you're seeing this at the director level, maybe we can do a little non-confrontational bringing together, and they'll learn an enormous amount from one another about what the actual practices are here and here. One way of avoiding that is Robert's kind of flat organization where you're sort of connected in a small group with everybody else. It's harder to maintain with these multiple bureaucracy, but you can't have it be completely flat. But in your case, you probably get very quick feedback on what everybody's doing because you're all sort of sharing a space. And
yeah, I think that I would agree with that. And I think one of the comments that I picked up from Paul's was the contact sport. And one of my colleagues always refers to this. He says, you know, we want to be playing up against the rules and pushing at the rules all the time. You know, so that comes into, because I was sort of yesterday and today I was thinking about the ethics issue and stuff. Where does that fit with what we do? Because we just bash materials around, and really it's got no societal impact in the sense of we're not going to do anyone harm, I don't believe, honestly. But the ethics comes in how you negotiate contracts, how you position yourself to get competitive advantage against, even within your own organisation, and then in parallel with other organisations outside, and how you develop a strategy that looks ahead and tries to second guess 2, 3, 4 moves out what's going to happen in the landscape, you know, and how does that then feed back to the students in the lab, you know, who could have come in 18 months ago in a project that's quite interesting, and the landscape changes. And suddenly they're on a sort of side water. You know, the project will run out, it will see to completion, but the game's moved on because something more dramatic has appeared for the agenda of the research centre as a whole and the collective decision. You know, and there's an interesting aspect in there in looking at that, and that comes into that thing of looking at the different hierarchies in the research activity. Yeah,
you've got a nimble space because it's relatively flat. You can reconfigure fast. Whereas incredibly bureaucratic organizations are designed so they're hard to reconfigure, you know. And the other thing I'd say about the competition space and the ethics of that is that really good competition depends on the right rules, right? I mean, if any sport, you can take a sports metaphor, if there are absolutely no rules in an American football game, everybody knocks everybody down, and it's quite entertaining, but it's not any kind of a game, you know, I'm sure it would probably sell well on American TV, actually, but you heard it first here, remember, it's my idea. They just run out in the field and knock each other down all the time, and there's no rules. But you depend on a sort of a framework of rules, and the part of the rules depends on a certain kind of virtue. Because there's always a way, somebody will always discover a way around the rules. And this has been one of the downfalls in the financial business, is a lot of the creativity was concerned about going around the rules. Yes, it's possible to go around them, but when you do, you can, to pursue another bad metaphor, you can blow a hole below the waterline. That will sink not just your business, but lots of others around it, and everybody goes down. So there's an element of virtue of that as well. So there are industries that call for themselves to be regulated, to say, we need some rules here, we need to be involved in setting them, because If we have all wide open, no holds barred competition, we're going to wreck each other. The innovation space is going to turn into a mess. I could say more about that, but so there is that kind of ethics. You can still have competition, perfectly, straightforward competition. I'm going to do everything I can to beat you within this rules or set of frameworks, and I'm going to push up against the edge of some of those rules. But there's certain things I'm not going to do. I hope. All right.
One more quick question.
If you want or whatever.
Well, if no one has a burning question, I'd like to
thank you all.
Mike Gorman very much.